Hi, everyone, and welcome to our workshop on leveraging AI in research writing. Thank you for joining us today. I'd love to hear from you in the chat. If you could let us know where you're joining us from, that would be great. We'll also have some polls throughout this presentation, so we'd love for you to participate in those polls. And then we'll also, of course, be happy to answer any questions that you have at the end of this workshop. So to get started, my name is Dr. Jessica Parker. I wear many hats. I am a professor. I supervise doctoral students at the Massachusetts College of Pharmacy and Health Sciences, where I also do generative AI research. I also run several academic companies, whether it's consulting or also have a generative AI company where we build formative feedback tools for emerging and established researchers. So Kimberly and I are very passionate about how to leverage AI, learning how to leverage it ethically and responsibly for things that are very high stakes, such as research. My co-founder, Kimberly Becker, is going to be presenting with me today. Kimberly, do you want to just briefly introduce yourself?
Sure, I was doing that in the chat, but I can do it here as well. My name is Kimberly Becker, and as Jessica said, we co-founded Moxie, which is an AI-driven writing assistant and coach. And I also am a doctoral writing consultant at Midland University. I have a background in corpus linguistics. My PhD is in linguistics and technology. So that's kind of how I got interested in AI.
So we're going to talk about a lot today. This is a jam-packed session. We're going to start by discussing AI literacy and why researchers need AI literacy. We'll also present a basic framework for AI literacy, and then we're going to go into some very specific and practical examples about how you can leverage AI ethically and responsibly for research writing. And then we'll have a Q&A. So while I'm presenting, Kimberly's going to be managing the chat and then vice versa. So if you have any questions about what we're discussing, feel free to drop that in the chat and we'll answer your questions as we move along. And then happy to have a more vibrant discussion at the end of the workshop. I want to start by addressing our ethos. And so when Kimberly and I talk about AI literacy and using AI in research writing, what we're bringing to the table is this lens of constructivism. And ultimately, what it comes down to is a lot of this research on AI is very machine-centric, but a constructivist approach really acknowledges the human in all of this. And we think that's really important to return back to. So at the end of the day, learners, humans, build knowledge through experiences. And learning happens through social interaction and dialogue. And knowledge is very contextual. And so because a lot of this has traditionally happened between, human to human, even though technology has played a large role in our work for years, we see a lot of similarities in how humans also interact with a chatbot because particularly large language models, which produce natural sounding human-like language, provide opportunities for humans to interact with something else, in this case, a machine that uses human language. And so it provides these opportunities for learning through this social constructivist landscape. And I love this quote: interaction with AI is a form of social constructivism where AI is a more knowledgeable other. And we saw traces of this in our very first study where we were exploring the use of ChatGPT, which is a frontier AI model for automated writing evaluation. And although this is a very new era, like this intelligence era that we're in, we have adapted before. And so I just want to remind everyone here of this history of human writing with technology, because a lot of the questions that we have today about how we're using AI to write and conduct research are not that different than questions that we've asked ourselves in the past, and we've been able to adapt. So I think most recently, like with my generation, when the internet came about and email and personal computers came about, we were in a sort of a crisis where everyone was worried about the quality and the depth of our writing through using emails and text messages. And somehow we've managed to adapt. Human writing has continued to be meaningful and a valuable skill. And so we believe that that will continue to be the case with generative AI. It's just going to look different. And we're still figuring that out, but we can always learn by looking back at our history. And so what we're seeing now with generative AI is this idea of AI assisted writing, and it's booming. And this article really acknowledges that it came out this May. And what we found interesting here is this quote from the article where it says, as an AI language model, I don't have direct access to current research articles or studies. However, I can provide with an overview, dot, dot, dot. And the reason we included this is because this is a sign of low AI literacy. Using AI models for tasks that they weren't designed to be used for. And so we see this a lot with Moxie, where people will go into Claude, for example, Claude 3.5 Sonnet, and they'll say, it's spitting out citations that aren't real, that don't exist. I'm like, well, that's not what it's made for. It's not connected to the internet. It's not designed to give you citations. And so this is an aspect of functional AI literacy where many of us are learning what are the capabilities and limitations of this tech, what are the specific use cases, despite the fact that we are using it. And so we are really big advocates for AI literacy and starting with functional literacy, which would sort of address these inappropriate uses of AI. And so we're just going to go ahead and start off by addressing the elephant in the room, because oftentimes when we give this presentation, the questions that we get are like, should I use AI to write? Can I use it? This question of can comes up quite a bit. So we want to get in front of that question because we're anticipating it coming up in the chat and say, the question isn't whether you can, it's actually the idea of how can you use it ethically and responsibly, because there is no single rule about using the tech or not. It's not a binary decision. Rather, we're all sort of learning what this technology can do. It's evolving really quickly. We're kind of building the plane while we're flying it. And so instead of asking this question that requires a binary response of can I use it, instead ask your question like, how can I learn how to use it ethically and responsibly? And so that's really the focus of this presentation today. And so why do researchers need AI literacy? Well, just take a look at some of these recent headlines. There's a lot of debates. There's a lot of polarizing views. Like I remember early on, the NSF came out and they said, you cannot use generative AI at all when you're writing a grant or use it as a method. And then that shifted. And we're seeing that all along in journal articles as well. And there's a lot of different opinions out there. Universities' guidelines are changing, they're evolving. New York City banned generative AI, ChatGPT in particular, in public schools, and now they're allowing it. And so navigating all of this, what we consider to be, a lot of it is noise, and finding that signal requires you to have some basic functional and critical understandings of how to leverage this technology, how to critically evaluate it, and how to co-create with it. And so part of these headlines are what we're starting to see on the marketing side is these companies that are advertising things like AI detectors and humanizers, where you use an AI to humanize AI generated text, which is really interesting. Turnitin it has already been used in tons of schools. I think there was a blog post that came out earlier this year that said they had already had like 2 million papers pass through Turnitin's AI writing detector, but they're still not accurate. And so there's a lot of challenges in detecting this AI generated text. First of all, at the most basic level, large language models, a type of generative AI, which is what ChatGPT and Claude is, they are trained on human language to mimic human language. So at the most basic level, that's why AI detectors are not reliable, because they're mimicking human language. I remember testing some of these tools, and I uploaded articles that I wrote years ago before generative AI even existed, and it said it was 100% AI generated. And so just try it out yourself before, especially before you think of accusing a student of using it. And so going back to that history of human AI writing and where we are today, and thinking about this idea of AI detectors and literacy and should I or can I or how do I use AI? Ultimately, Kimberly and I sit on this spectrum of human AI writing. Like we really believe that how you leverage AI for research and writing really depends on your level. Are you an emerging researcher? Are you an expert? What is the task? And then also thinking about the context. So are you submitting to a journal? What are their guidelines on how you can leverage AI? Are you writing a grant? So it's not a simple yes or no answer. And what we're seeing is that this synthetic writing that's coming about, it's definitely on a spectrum. So we have what we've always known to be true at one end of the spectrum, which is fully human AI, fully human writing. And then now we have these like two components in the middle where we have human in the loop writing, which is very human driven, where human is doing the prompting, they're going through iterations of output, they're critically evaluating it. Then on the other side of that, we have machine in the loop writing, where maybe the machine is doing a lot of the heavy lifting. And there do believe there are appropriate use cases for this. And then we have fully synthetic writing. And so when you're using AI for research, I would imagine, especially if you're an expert in your field, that you might be leveraging AI through this whole continuum of the spectrum, depending on what the task is and what tools you're using. So I'm going to hand it over to Kimberly now. She's going to do a deeper dive into our AI literacies framework, which is based on existing digital literacy theories. And this is really the cornerstone of our work with researchers and helping them navigate this new landscape. So Kimberly?
Hi, everyone. Welcome if you're just joining us a little bit late. I'm Kimberly Becker, and today we are talking about research writing and AI, and this is part of how we teach AI literacy. We like to give people three different categories to think about. So AI literacy is not knowing everything. It is a gradual buildup of understanding what it means. And so this is a way that you can probably start to understand, but it will take some time if you're new to AI. And I see that someone had a hand raised. If you could just use the Q&A tool, I think Jessica will be able to answer your question as I'm talking and vice versa. So the first part of AI literacy is functional. That means you need to really understand what the tools do under the hood and how to navigate their interfaces and their platforms. If you don't know how they work and how they operate, then it's very hard to be able to identify the limitations and the potential of the technology, because there are misuses of AI and then there are unethical uses of AI. And those are two different things. Functionally, understanding how it works is the first step. And in the next section, I'm going to talk about this, and I think you'll leave with a much better understanding of it if you're new to AI. Critical is the next step. And if you notice in the visual, these build on each other. So we start with functional and then we expand. Once we have functional, we expand to critical. This is where we're able to evaluate the accuracy and reliability of AI generated content and assess the quality. And it really involves critical thinking. That's why it's called critical. So using those higher order thinking skills like evaluation, analysis, and really trying to find where it's biased so that you can analyze the output. Because ultimately, if you're going to use the output, whether you're using it wholesale, as I do sometimes in emails and in social media posts and kind of those lower stakes communicative goals that I have, then I want to be sure that I'm representing myself well with that output text. So whether you're using it wholesale, like in a lower stakes assignment or job, or whether you're adapting it for higher stakes, which is what I suggest for sure, you really need to be critical of that output. And then the last stage is rhetorical. And this is where it all comes together and where you're able to identify patterns in AI generated text so that you can see the difference in human writing and AI generation. And I like to use two different words for that, just to remind myself that it's not really writing, it's generating. And then rhetorical AI literacy includes being able to understand style, tone, voice, and compare and contrast AI versus human generated content, not to detect it, but just to understand what makes it up and what makes it different. So now we have a poll, and the question is, how would you rate your current understanding of generative AI? So you can just weigh in. we
Well,
would,
can you see the results? Or do I need to read
yes,
them out? Okay.
yes, I can see the results. I'm just gonna shift my blind or my window really quick. Sun is in my eyes. Okay, much better. Sorry about that. Yeah, as you're finishing that up, I just see a comment in the chat about people who do not speak English as a first language using AI to refine and edit ideas and thoughts rather than generate new ideas. Yes, I think this is a wonderful use of it. My background is in my master's degree. My background, I spent about a decade teaching English as a second language. So I think it's such a great tool for this, especially if you are taking what you've already written and then using it to refine it. Yeah, so great point, Kahabi. All right, so it looks like most people are kind of in the middle. That's good. That's sort of what we expected. So that aligns with how we are, how we designed these slides. So I think that is well aligned. Okay, so let's start by talking about what we mean about AI. So people throw around the acronym AI all the time, and that means a lot of different things. So in terms of understanding where these basic terminologies fit into kind of the world of AI, just briefly, AI is a very large term for a lot of different things, including machine learning, including deep learning, which is where neural networks get involved. And we're not going to get into all these kind of details, but basically want to see that when we say AI, we're talking about a lot of different things. But in the center there is that generative AI or Gen AI. And this is what we're talking about today. So generative AI uses an LLM, that stands for large language model. And a large language model is made up of data, a whole bunch of data. Like if you can imagine 21 different Library of Congresses. So the Library of Congress in the US is one of the biggest libraries in our country, but I believe in the world. It's 21 of those. That's how much data is there. Petabytes of data. I didn't even know that word until I learned about large language models. So lots and lots and lots of data. Plus an architecture where a transformer, and that's why ChatGPT is called GPT. It's generative pre-trained transformer. That's the architecture that allows it to pull from that data and put together new sentences. And then there's training, there's machine training, and there's human training. And again, we're not going to get into all of this, but basically that's what makes up an LLM. So it's not magic, it's predictive. So if we have a sentence like the color of the sky is something, what an LLM would do with that is it would make a prediction. Well, what is the likely next word that's going to follow when we just have a general sentence or statement about the color of the sky? Well, it looks into its data and then it generates the word blue because blue is the most likely color. But when we add context, like if we said it's raining, the color of the sky is, now it's not going to generate blue because when it's raining, cloudy, stormy, the color of the sky is gray. And because of all the context inside the language model, because of all that data, it can successfully predict that that next word is going to be gray. And so it does that word by word, phrase by phrase, sentence by sentence, and it outputs all of these things. So it seems magical, but it's really not. And there's an age-old computer science principle that I think it's really important to remember, which is called GIGO. It's an acronym for garbage in means garbage out. So with an LLM, we have two kinds of garbage, I guess you could think of. We have we have what's already there in the data, which we can't do anything about. And then we have what we input as a question, a statement, a request, a prompt to the LLM. And so we have to really think about if what we're putting in is going to be reflected in what we get out, and so is that data. So we really need, this is the functional literacy that I was talking about earlier. Here's an example of, let's imagine that this is a graduate student asking a large language model like ChatGPT in this case to help me improve a purpose statement in a research article. And the purpose statement is, this study intends to address the existing gap in the literature on flipped classroom learning activities and student achievement. And so what does ChatGPT do? It says, certainly, happy to help, always happy to help. We need to enhance the clarity and specificity of the purpose statement to, define the scope and direction. And here's a refined version. It just outputs this refined version. Here you go. Here's a little gift. Where's the learning there? So as Jessica talked about in the constructivist learning theory, when we are interacting with a more knowledgeable other, we have to have that kind of push and pull to get the learning. So if we're getting this and then we take this and we just use it, we feel this is quite unethical. We feel this is not the way to go because there's no learning happening. Maybe you understand this is a little more clear, this is a little more specific, but how did that happen? What was the process? And so that's really what we want to focus on is moving in that direction. All right. How familiar are you with using AI tools in your research process? Just take a minute and think about that. Okay, I think we have most people. Looks like about half of you are somewhat familiar, and the rest of you are, some of you not familiar at all. That's great. You're in the right place. Moderately familiar, very familiar. Okay, great. Thank you. Good to know. Before we dive into kind of how to use AI for research writing, let's back up a step and talk about writing, components of writing, and what includes writing. So a lot of people, when they think about writing, they think about that bottom part of this inverted triangle that's on the screen. They think about accuracy. They think about mechanics. They think about spelling, grammar, punctuation, citation format. And that is one aspect of writing. It's a very important aspect. But notice that in this diagram, it's the smallest aspect. It's tiny because there are other things that matter more and that come before this part of the writing process. The very first step that we advocate for is examining the depth. And depth has to do with the variety and range of language, the variety and range of ideas, sources, and analysis. So how far are you kind of expanding into a given topic? And we're talking about research writing. It's complex, it's sophisticated, and it needs to go deep. And so that's the first aspect that you want to explore. We know that AI is actually not quite good at this. AI is very broad, very generalized. And so depth is something only a human can bring to writing. And that's why we start there. And that's why it's biggest and most important. Flow is how we connect those ideas. So if depth is kind of the range of our ideas, language, etc., flow is how we're connecting them fluently and how we're presenting them in terms of the actual communication. And then finally, at the bottom, the smallest piece of writing is really accuracy. And this is the piece that I think can very, very easily be automated because rule-based systems like computers that have algorithms are great at finding where you have broken a rule. So in the bottom here, we're talking about prescribed rules about things. So Grammarly is really good at this. ChatGPT can be used for this. I mean, it can definitely help you, but something like Grammarly is really going to teach you, but it should be done last. It should be done when everything else is in place because it prevents you from working on your depth. If you're focused too much on accuracy, you lose sight of the depth. So today, we're going to look at this from the perspective of depth, flow, and accuracy. We're going to start by talking about 2 tools you can use to help you improve the depth in your research writing. Then we're going to talk about a tool you can use to help you improve flow. And then we're going to finally just quickly discuss, most of you probably have heard of and know about Grammarly, but we'll talk a little bit about that as well. Now I think I'm going to turn it over to Jessica. Turn it back over.
Thanks, Kimberly. By the way, I can't see the Q&A. So if, Kimberly, I don't know if folks are adding questions there, if you want to see what's there, but there isn't much going on in the chat. So we're going to show you some specific tools that you can use for those components of writing. But I think having a framework to arm yourself with is helpful. This is something that I have been searching for early on teaching my students. And from a research perspective, this is the framework that I feel most comfortable with. Like I'm not violating any sort of academic integrity, or I just feel like I can still produce really high quality work that's true to my original ideas by following this framework. So this is kind of addressing that question that I talked about earlier, which is the how. Not can you use AI, but how can you leverage it ethically and responsibly? And so the most common way that I use it for research is a lot of times I'll start with an AI, and there's several ways you can do that. Like I don't have writer's block anymore. There's no more blank page. I immediately start brainstorming with AI as I'm starting to think about things like theory or breaking down a large research question or objective into smaller objectives. I'll use a literature search engine like Litmaps or Elicit or Consensus to help me explore the ideas of others and analyze those sources. And so there's a lot of AI work in that initial sort of step, if you will. We call that AI exploration. And then in the middle is me. This is where the major cognitive lift is happening. I'm preparing a draft. I'm triangulating all these new tools that I have and what I'm learning from them alongside of my own original ideas and what I know to be true as an expert in my field. And so I'm doing all of that work that sort of takes in the ideas that I got through with the AI through collaboration with AI initially, and then pulling it all together into an initial draft. And when I say draft, it doesn't have to be a draft of an entire manuscript or proposal. It could be just a draft of a certain section of the proposal or whatever it may be. And then I love to go back to the AI to get feedback. And the feedback that you ask for is going to be dependent upon you as an individual. So at this stage in my career, I'm familiar with a lot of tendencies, the undesirable or suboptimal tendencies I have in my writing. For instance, I tend to write in passive voice. I don't try to address that when I'm writing a draft. I just write, in passive voice. And then part of my feedback process is I'll ask the AI to identify instances of passive voice and help me convert it to active voice. So I am aware of those areas that need improvement in my writing. So a lot of times I'll focus on things I'm aware of. And then I'll also just ask the AI to give me feedback on other things like ways to strengthen my argument, or what assumptions am I making, or what are potential criticisms of this, as if I'm collaborating with a human. Like if Kimberly were in my office while I'm conducting research, those are the types of conversations I might have with her. But Kimberly, doesn't have unlimited time and availability. So a lot of times I'll leverage the AI in that way. So this is that AI sandwich framework. So when we think about working with a literature review, for example, that's like the cornerstone of academic research. There's a lot of different ways you can leverage AI. You could use an AI tool such as Claude, ChatGPT to help you develop a search strategy. Maybe you're new to research, you've never conducted a lit review before, and you're struggling to come up with search strings. That's one simple way to use AI. Synonyms, keywords. You can also use an AI literature search engine like Litmaps, which we really like, to help you search for seminal literature. That seed paper is something really interesting that Litmaps does. There are other tools like Consensus and Elicit and Cite that do the same. And you can use AI to help you screen what you found, like taking the results of several literature searches and combining them into an evidence table. You can use it to help you look for patterns. These large language models are great at looking for patterns. You can learn how to synthesize. So there's a lot of aspects of the literature review process you can leverage AI for. So this is just an example of how I might use it to develop a search strategy. So I give it the topic, and then based off of that topic, it outputs some very specific synonyms and research methodologies that I might want to leverage, and then different concepts along with ethical and practical considerations. And so it's using that context that I gave it to give me suggestions for a search strategy. And so just reminding you of GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. The more information I give it, the more likely I am to get what I'm looking for. And so additional context is not always needed, but if you're not getting what you're looking for, give it additional context to try to wrangle it and get it to give you that high quality output that it can often give you. There are a lot of different AI, research assistants, literature search engines out there. There's new ones coming out all the time. Kimberly, in a moment, is going to talk about the corpus behind a lot of these search engines and why it's important to, from an AI literacy perspective, is to understand the data that's available for these different search engines. So I'll just give you a brief example. Like Scite was one of the first AI research assistants I used, and most of the data that it pulls from, the literature it has access to, is in the biomedical domain. And most of these tools pull from open access databases. I now also love Elicit for different reasons. Litmaps is one of my favorites. I just encourage you that before you choose one, do a little bit of your homework to understand what that tool has access to, so you're not using the wrong tool. Like if you're in their humanities, it wouldn't have made sense to use Scite. You would have definitely thought there was a gap in the literature because it's primarily pulling from biomedical databases. And so we put together this comparison table, and keep in mind that this is evolving, like the corpus that's being used to power these research assistants is evolving. I'm going to let Kimberly jump in here because she put this table together and she's a corpus linguist. So she's going to talk to you about what a corpus is and why it's important to have that corpus in mind when you're choosing an AI tool.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, so we know that AI basically, as I talked about, has a lot of data. So any large language model already has a lot of data, but it doesn't necessarily have any specific access to articles. It may have scraped the web and gotten some articles and stored that in its data training. But regardless, it's not going to output that like sentence by sentence from an article for you, and it's going to get things mixed up. And so one reason that you don't want to use ChatGPT or Claude or Gemini for locating research is because it is not connected to a specific database. A corpus is just a database. It comes from the word cuerpo, from Spanish, from Latin. It means body. It means body of text. So these are companies that have tools that function as research assistants. So Litmaps is one I'm going to demo, and Elicit is another I'm going to demo. But there are also these are all good for different reasons. Scite is also good. Consensus is good. There are some on that previous slide, and we'll send you the slides where you can explore these on your own. Some of them have free features, some of them don't. So, you're going to need to do your research on this, but we've tried to summarize a little bit here about the key features. So Litmaps is great for exploring interactively how the literature kind of maps out chronologically, so in time order, and how literature cites other literature. And I'll give you an example in just a minute. Elicit is great for exporting a literature matrix, which a lot of graduate students have to do. Scite is good for other things. Consensus is good for other things. For purposes of time, I'm going to gloss over that and tell you that we will share these slides with you, and then you can move on from there and do your own research. But the data corpus is really important because as you are doing these things, which I'll show you, Litmaps and Elicit, you have to know that they don't have access to everything. They only have access to things that are right now are publicly available. So for Litmaps, the idea is you want to locate a seed paper. So think about what a seed does. A seed is the start of a plant. Okay, so this is the vocabulary and the words that Litmaps uses. They like to seed your research. And so you put in a topic, an author, or a specific title, and they're going to map out the literature for you in that area. You can go ahead and forward the slide. So for example, if you search for AI and research writing in Litmaps' interface, it will give you several different articles to choose from. Once you click on one of those articles, it will output a map, okay? So the blue and the kind of red is my addition to this screenshot. So here you have the article. It gives you kind of an overview. It gives you the abstract. It tells you the DOI, where it's published. And over here, you have this kind of, it's hard. It's a little bit hard to see on this slide, but basically this is the map. And each of these little bubbles represents a reference or a citation, so a source. And how they are organized visually in the map is how current they are. So these are older than these. And that is the x-axis. And on the y-axis, it is how well sighted they are. So these along this line here are not as well sighted as this one. And this one is obviously the most well sighted. It's also the oldest. So of course, this is connected, right? The longer something has been in publication, the more likely it is to be cited. So it's really important that when you're looking at this map, you understand what you're looking at. And then there are lines that connect them too. So ExploreLit Maps, it's a great tool. One of my favorites, has a great corpus on the back end, pretty robust corpus. But no matter how robust the corpus is, there are some disciplines that just do not have open access materials as much as other disciplines. So, for example, this is Semantic Scholar's database according to discipline, and Semantic Scholar is the backend database on all of these research tools. Some of them have other ones in addition to Semantic Scholar to diversify, but all of them have Semantic Scholar. So this just gives you an idea. Most of those articles are uncategorized, so we don't even know what discipline they're in. But the second most common type of article comes from medicine, biology, physics, engineering, computer. So we're looking at like really hard sciences, physical sciences, natural sciences. And then we have kind of some social sciences down here. And now this is still a lot. It looks like a tiny bit, but this is 6.2 million papers. Okay. So we're not, I mean, you're looking at like a big drop, but it's still in the millions. But if you're in the humanities, geography, maybe history, those particular disciplines don't publish as much open access. Their journals are more closed and behind paywalls. And so you're not going to find that there. So you can go ahead and forward the slide. And so let's look at an example. This is Perplexity. Perplexity uses Semantic Scholar. Perplexity is a great all-purpose tool. Somebody a minute ago in the Q&A was asking about, they said, I work in government and I'm also doing a PhD. Perplexity is the most general tool that you can use to use AI with sources to find an answer. So in Perplexity, you can search, you can ask anything, but you can also focus it. So if you click this little toggle right here, when you go to Perplexity, which is free, you can narrow it. You can narrow it just to academic search, which is Semantic Scholar. You can just write where it's not connected to any database. You can just connect it to YouTube or Reddit, or you can search across the entire web. So if you're doing something like grant writing, for example, you may not just want to search in academic. You may want to see what websites like government sources or other nonprofit sources are publishing in white papers. And that may be, here in the all search across the whole web. Go ahead and forward to the next slide. I searched for common theories in humanities for approaching AI literacy. And that was my human question. And Perplexity gave me this source. Now, look at this source. It's called Psychology for Lawyers, Understanding the Human Factor. This is not at all what I was looking for. And the AI summary says the provided search does not directly address theories in the humanities. So the tool is better able to tell you, unlike ChatGPT, which is just going to make something up regardless. It's going to predict that next word, predict the word, even if it doesn't have a source because of its training. But Perplexity and these tools that have sources on the back end, Corpora, are able to give you a source-informed answer. So be really careful, especially if you're in the humanities and the social sciences. If you're a novice and you're using these, be especially careful. This is my advice as a corpus linguist. If you don't find something in that particular tool you're using, be careful because it might not be a gap in the literature. It might be just a gap in the corpus. And that corpus may not have articles you're looking for because they're behind a paywall somewhere. You need to triangulate your research. And I think that's what the next slide says. Yes. So You can use an AI research assistant. They're great, but that doesn't mean you stop using your library database, Google Scholar, and talking to other scholars, ResearchGate, looking really in all the areas, because graduate level, you need to be fully informed. And so you're really going to have to start looking outside. It's not an easy quick fix. AI is often sold to us in that way. Be more productive, be more efficient. Graduate level research writing and beyond is not going to be super efficient ever, no matter how many great tools we have. It's a process. And I believe Jessica is going to take over now.
Yeah. So Elicit is another tool that you can use. It also, you can find sources, and all of these different tools have different features, and I like them for different reasons. And they're starting to come out with similar features, like they're copying each other, because this is not intellectual property, the ability to like extract data from PDFs. But one thing that Elicit did early on that I liked, because I have my graduate students do it, and this is something I used to do manually, because I learned through that process of manually extracting the information and populating it into a table, was creating a literature matrix, or an evidence table, you might call it. So with Elicit, you can upload papers. You can identify the papers in Elicit, or you can upload papers you found outside of Elicit. And then you can choose the different columns you want in your evidence table, depending on what you're looking for. Different fields of study look for different things. And then you can use AI to help you analyze that table for different patterns, because this is what we typically do, as a human without the help of AI. And so I don't typically start by having the AI do it for me. Typically, I'll have it check behind me. So I like to start with my own ideas. And then typically what happens through this process of having the AI do the extraction and analyzing for patterns is I'll start to see things that I missed. So Elicit is really great for that. And then we have a literature matrix analyzer tool. This is one of the first tools that I created because I wanted my students to use it. And on the back end, we've designed that tool to do very specific things. We tell it to look for themes. We tell it to look for patterns. We tell it to identify potential gaps in the literature. And again, back to what Kimberly said, it might not be a gap in the literature, it could be a gap in the corpus. It's only looking at what you give it. So if you only give it 10 articles and it tells you what the gap is, it's based off of those 10 articles in your evidence table, not the overall literature. And then it gives you ideas for recommendations for further research. So that's one way that you could leverage a large language model to help you with this aspects of analyzing an evidence table. So those are different literature research assistants or search tools. Let's now look at the use of AI for, we like to use it for formative feedback. You could think of it as peer review. So I'm going to launch this poll. I'd love to know, regardless of whether you're an emerging researcher or you're an established researcher, like how would you rate your ability to get quick quality feedback, whether it be from a colleague, a peer, a professor? This is something that Kimberly and I hear about a lot because we do partner with universities, and students often want much more feedback than we can give. Yeah, I can get quality feedback, but it's not quick. This is the most common response that I'm seeing. A little more than 55% of you can get quality feedback, but it's not quick. And this is one of the arguments that we have about how AI can be used. It's not perfect, but in terms of, like when I think about my average graduate student, and now they're saying GPT-4 1.0 has the advanced reasoning capabilities and the intelligence of like a first-year PhD student. Going back to this idea of social constructivism and interacting with a more knowledgeable other, if you're just learning academic writing, or if you're learning about some aspect of your research where you would rely on a more knowledgeable other to give you that quality feedback, but it's not quick, this is where AI could really come in handy. It does require that critical lens because it's not always accurate, but there are so many more opportunities now to get quick feedback. And I would argue that based on the input, again, that context is important, that you can get quality feedback that is quick with a large language model. And so when we think about feedback, going back to that inverted triangle that Kimberly talked about, those components of writing where we have depth, flow, and accuracy, When we think about how this relates to using AI for feedback. So like Moxie creates tools, and all of our tools leverage one of the frontier large language models. So you don't have to use Moxie for this. If you have the ability to provide adequate context and criteria directly to a large language model, then you could get the same output. So when we think of fluency level details, Moxie focuses a lot on giving you feedback on the structure and the organization of your writing, coherence and cohesion, argumentation, and how you're integrating research with your ideas, like to strengthen your claims or to address assumptions and biases or debates in the literature. So that's at the fluency level. And then you could still continue to use Grammarly, I'd say, is the most popular tool for different accuracy level details like punctuation, spelling, word choice, style, grammar, etc. Again, you could use a large language model for this, but my argument is it's a waste of a large language model. Like, we don't need to use the energy and the resources involved for these large language models to do things that a software like Grammarly can do. And so these are different components of when we think about AI-powered feedback, and what I would hope that you're thinking about, regardless of where you're getting this feedback from, whether it be Moxie's tools, ChatGPT, or Claude. These are the same elements of what we look for in good, high-quality, human-generated feedback, which is first and foremost clarifying what the standards are. What are the criteria that we're using to evaluate this piece of writing? And it's going to be different based on the field of study, the discipline, the genre. But in this case, we have a synthesis checklist that's very specific to literature reviews for research articles, dissertations, or theses. I typically like to include visual elements in this feedback, so it's not just a block of text. I think about that similarly when I'm giving a student written feedback. I don't want to just write out 6 paragraphs. Like, I'm just going to lose them in how that's being presented. Also providing explanations for the feedback, and then making very actionable recommendations to the writer. So these are things that I try to do with a human. And so these are the things that I'm looking for good, high quality AI-powered feedback. In addition to just, is it accurate? That's the obvious here that we want to get right. Sorry, my screen just shifted. Now I can't see the top of the slide. All right. So staying with this idea of fluency in writing, coherence is a component of fluency. And one aspect of coherence is paragraph unity. And this is something that we see a lot of novice scholars struggle with, especially when they're learning academic writing, is a lot of times we'll see multiple main ideas presented in a paragraph, and or no evidence or only evidence with no claim, no voice on behalf of the author, little to no analysis. And so the meal plan is one of my favorite frameworks for structuring a cohesive paragraph. And what meal stands for, M is the main idea, so that's your topic sentence. E is the evidence, so what evidence are you pulling from the literature to support that main idea? And then the analysis, that comes after the evidence. That's your take on that evidence, your analysis of it. So that's in your voice. And then how you connect that paragraph to either the thesis statement or the next paragraph. So you're either leading out to the next paragraph or linking back. That's your transition sentence. And so cohesive paragraphs have these components. And I think it's an easy way to think about how you're going to evaluate a paragraph. And so when you think about a way that you could use a large language model to look at something like coherence, you could use the meal plan. You could give the large language model these components of a meal plan. You could even give it an example of a meal plan paragraph, and then ask it to give you feedback on your own writing. So we created a tool for this because, again, this is one of the assignments that I have my students do. So I started building generative AI tools mostly for my students to help me help them. And so this is the type of feedback you might get on your meal plan, where with Moxie, we've designed the tools to give you like an overall summary of the feedback, and then look at each sentence in the paragraph and break it down, determine whether that sentence is the main idea, evidence, analysis, link, or lead, a status, whether it's good to go or it needs work, and then an explanation followed by some specific actionable recommendations. And so this is like really zooming into specific components of your writing. And many of you, like I think about my doc students, might not even be aware of these different frameworks or criteria for evaluating academic writing. And that's okay. The goal is to learn, and you don't know what you don't know, but you could start out by using like a more general purpose academic writing tool. Like we have a writing diagnostic that looks at lots of different aspects of your writing. You identify those issues, and then you start to hone in on those specific issues over time. Oh, I thought I had more slides. Okay, I think that's it. We have 10 minutes left. Kimberly, were there any questions in the Q&A or anything that we could address live with folks?
There were lots of questions about the different research tools and whether or not they're free. And I put a note in the chat about this. I just want to say, none of these tools are going to be free long term. If you are going to continue to use these tools, they are using energy. They are pulling from an AI, a large language model. They are pulling from a database. Companies have to pay for all that. And so none of these tools are going to be free. In the same way that your library database at your university is free for you to use. That's not free either, by the way. You probably pay a hefty student fee to contribute to that. It's part of your tuition. So you can use them. You can usually try them for free for a certain amount of time, or they have a limited use case where you can, use a certain number of tokens. And tokens is how we measure interactions between humans and AI. So it's like credits. But at some point, you're gonna have to pay for this because it's a resource and it's human developed and it's machine developed, and those things cost money. So I mean, nothing that's really worth anything is ever free, and certainly you can ask for student discounts, and there are ways around that. But yeah, eventually you will have to pay for most of these tools.
There's a really good question. So it's interesting. We had a slide. So Carly asked about plagiarism, like losing the ownership of writing. And we did have a slide on this, but we didn't think we had time to address it. And so there's an academic researcher who's really passionate about this idea of we're in this post-plagiarism era. Her name is Sarah Eaton. She's at the University of Calgary. And Kimberly and I very much agree with Sarah. And Dr. Eaton's work is about how we're in this post-plagiarism era. So before generative AI, she was really passionate about academic integrity. And now that we have this generative AI era that we're in, there's lots of questions that are coming up around cheating and plagiarism. So I'm going to try to break it down in a very simple way. So you can't plagiarize a large language model because it's not an author, and there's no way you can rectify that. So when you think about traditional plagiarism, a student has taken the words of another author. If you talk to them about it, it's a learning opportunity. They can go back to the source and they can rectify this plagiarism instance. That you can't do that because a large language model is not pulling full sentences from a single source, and it is not an author. It can't take ownership. So our standard definition of plagiarism does not apply with generative AI. And so we're all trying to figure out how to deal with that. But academic integrity still applies. So I'm going to talk about this from an academic integrity perspective instead of using the term plagiarism. So when you think about it from an academic integrity perspective, it's no different than you passing off the work of another author. Even though the large language model is not an author, you would not want to have the AI totally write something for you where it's not your ideas, you haven't evaluated it, and then pass it off as your own. Like that's at one end of the spectrum, that seems more obvious for people. It's in this middle sort of gray area where there's a lot of unknowns and where we're seeing journals sort of shift their guidelines. What Kimberly and I are seeing across the board is this sort of stage that we're in, which I think we'll be in for a while, it feels appropriate, is of disclosure. So my first response would be, what does the journal say? So if you're submitting, or the funding agency or your professor say, what are the guidelines for the task? And making sure that you're adhering to those. So if generative AI is banned, then don't use it. Don't violate that guideline. But if it's allowed, which we're starting to see that it is, especially as a method, like where you're using generative AI to analyze data or create synthetic data or pilot an interview protocol or as an intervention in learning, that's one thing. That's describing how you use the technology as a method, just as you would any other software. Like I was reading a scoping review this morning where they used, I think it's Ryan, Rayyan, to help them with a scoping review. And the way they disclose the use of that is similar to how you might say you used NVivo to analyze your qualitative data. So that's one layer of like disclosure. The other is describing the role of the generative AI in your work. So Kimberly and I have started doing this in our publications where we say up front, like, we brainstormed and we ideated with AI, or we had it go in and do X, Y, and Z, but ultimately we reviewed the output, we critically evaluated it, we edited it, and we take full responsibility for it. And so that idea of disclosure and acknowledging the role of AI in your work is really important, but the standard definition of plagiarism does not apply. How are we doing on time? Okay. Anything else come up, Kimberly? See a lot happening in the chat.
I haven't looked at the chat. I'm answering questions in the Q&A.
Okay.
There's a question about, should researchers learn, and I'm answering it, but maybe you have some input. Should researchers learn to build their own tools using Jan AI or another source that is hosted on their own computer? I don't know what Jan AI is, and I'm not familiar, but I've answered the question based on like proprietary data that might be patent worthy, but
Yeah,
I
I think it
ultimately that.
depends. Yeah, I think what's hard is the questions that we get, which I'm not saying isn't anything wrong with the questions. People are looking for like rule of thumb responses, like do this, don't do that. And the reality is this is very multifaceted, and it's very individualized. It's very contextual. And so it really depends. Like if you're analyzing really sensitive data that you shouldn't be using generative AI for, then yes, you might need to start thinking about how to work within specific closed systems where privacy can be guaranteed. But that isn't always necessary. It really depends. There are settings, like in ChatGPT, for example, although the language that they use has changed. Early on, there was a toggle where you can turn off the chat history in training. So your chats weren't stored. You couldn't access those chats again. They essentially disappear once you close the session. So that's one way that researchers have addressed it, but it's challenging because we're not computer scientists. And a lot of people don't even understand the disclosures and how these companies are describing how that data is used and protected. And we are not experts at that either. We're definitely learning, but the response that I think that you're looking for is, I don't have, because I think it is very contextualized. It depends on the data.
There's a question about how Moxie is different from these other research tools. I put a pretty extensive answer, but I don't know if you want to jump in.
Yeah, I'll just say, well, Kimberly and I when we started Moxie, we come from the perspective of we're still professors, we work with students, and we care a lot about academic integrity and ethical and responsible use. And I wanted to give my students the ability to use AI in a way that wasn't going to put them in a position where they would even be tempted to cheat. So our first goal was to be able to build tools that had guardrails to highly discourage the AI from doing things for them. And so we're in this sort of corner of the market where we work really hard to design tools that have guardrails so that it's not going to instantly start just generating your work for you and doing it for you, so that we can maintain the integrity of original scholarship. And that's really our ethos, and that's how we're different. Like many of the other companies that exist in this space, we're built on top of existing frontier models like ChatGPT, Claude 3.5, Gemini, we even have Perplexity. But the way we've designed our tools are different in that we don't want it to be as easy as you push a button and it writes your lit review or your problem statement or whatever it may be for you. We're really big on that human in the loop. Well, it looks like we are out of time. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, for the wonderful questions. We do lots of webinars and professional development sessions. I think Kimberly shared a link to our YouTube channel, so feel free to check out a lot of that free professional development. And I'll let Caroline take it from here.
Yes, thanks everyone so much for joining. I hope you enjoyed the session. And if you have any other plans to join the conference in another capacity, I hope you enjoy that as well. And from me, have a great afternoon wherever you are in the world, maybe a great morning, a great evening.